Yeah.
I mean, I just looked at the first couple of questions,
Sure.
so I haven't thought about this deeply, but I feel like if I were the person proposing the research, that I'm oftentimes blind to my own values, and so that if I were trying to answer what values are reflected in the design of the study, that I might not be the best person to recognize them. Kind of like you don't necessarily recognize the influence of your own culture on yourself
Absolutely.
until you maybe get outside of your own culture. And
Yeah.
so I'm wondering who's answering these questions.
Well, maybe just based on your comment is that no one should ever review their own study that way. I don't know, can you hear me? Is that the mic still carrying? Okay. I want to lean, I'm tired. It's like you can never edit your own paper, because you're going to be blind to all of the errors that you think make total sense, and someone else can look at it. So I don't know. That's a great question. I think that maybe it should be one element as the PI, but maybe it's someone else who's never seen it can look at this and go over those questions and then compare. But I'd like to hear can anyone else have any ideas of, we're all going to be all blind to our own biases. How would we go about uncovering the things that we're naturally blind to?
Well, there's a lot of work being done with the implicit association test. I don't remember who's
I think Harvard does that.
right now, but
Yeah.
there a lot of, especially academic organizations, are starting to encourage their researchers to take it themselves to try to uncover their own biases. So maybe encouraging researchers to do that on their own. It can be a private self-exploration.
I think it's a great idea. So just like as a matter of course, if you want to go through IRB, you have to take this test and say, oh, I got some junk, I got some baggage that I'm bringing to the table at least, and let's acknowledge it. That's a starter for maybe what other biases might I be giving into my study design. Does that feel helpful at all?
I think to some extent.
Yeah, it's not all the way. I agree. It doesn't get you to, oh my God, I've been totally racist in my question design. I need to fix that. So first of all, this is hard. Owning our stuff is hard. I took that test, and it's super uncomfortable. And I look at the results, I'm like, I'm not racist. I'm not sexist. This test is broken, obviously. But there is really common implicit bias in every person who's ever taken it. And so it can be really uncomfortable and difficult to own the stuff that we're bringing to research. And no one wants to do it. No one's naturally just good at this. And, so yeah.
IRBs have community members
Okay.
on them. I think that's mandated.
Okay.
And I think community members have a perspective that's, I'm guessing that while they're on the IRB, they get trained in kind of methodologies.
Sure.
But that they should be looking at the research with an eye that's not a researcher's eye. And I wonder, if IRBs, and I don't know that you can represent every.
You mean having a diversity in IRB membership? Yeah. If you have a bunch of white men that's going to make up your IRB, they're going to have different interpretations and advice potentially than having a really diverse and representative group. I agree. Other questions? Yeah.
This is more super meta level, but I'm real interested in medical humanities, and I think I had a past life as more of a hardcore medical librarian, but I now work at a liberal arts college, and I work in more with more interdisciplinary disciplines. But I think kind of what you were saying is, our culture as a whole, we like to think of science as hardcore, truth. It's, there's nothing about feelings or intellect that are influencing it, when, we all know in our heart of hearts that that's not true. Or maybe some people don't think that or know that. But anyway,
Sure.
I think there are some movements advocating for more humanities education, medicine, and bringing more interdisciplinary perspectives into medicine and science. And I think a lot of these conversations are great examples of why humanities education and why interdisciplinary perspectives are so important in the sciences and in medicine, because then, in theory, studying those kinds of topics help people to, you know, do things like interrogate their biases and think about, you know, their life trajectories and the life trajectories of those around them. So I think another approach to helping us interrogate our biases would be to stop so heavily divorcing sciences and humanities.
Yeah, former philosophy undergrad. Like, I'm totally with you. I think it's amazing.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, our school kind of does that at this point. So we're a STEM school, but we have a large humanities requirement. We do a lot of group work, and the groups do a lot of group dynamic work and have to do some implicit bias work as well. They just started that recently. And that has brought up some interesting things between just not their study, but just how they relate to each other in the group dynamics. And I think expanding that would be excellent. And also when I meet with them, this is just on a very, very small level, but like when I consult with researchers, I generally focus on just, if they're thinking of science as like these hard facts, I don't usually bring it back to like, or talk about it in the context of feelings, but more in the context of science and research and scientific inquiry. Like, you're not gonna stop trying to interrogate what you're doing. There's no end to it. You're not just like done. Like, you know, so encouraging them to continue pursuing, you know, asking the questions like what surprised you, what is up against what, you know, what your argument is. And just those kinds of questions, encouraging them to interrogate more generally, and get into that mode and stop being like just satisfied and making assumptions of like, well, this is what it is.
That's interesting, yeah.
So you said that as a graduate student was your first encounter with IRB, and that it was just like you have to fill out this form, right? So that's most people's experience. So I think that one of the answers would be just to better integrate the whole IRB structure into the curriculum, where it's not something that you're hearing about at the last minute before your project is due, or it's something that you're thinking about the whole time, just as you would a data management plan. Start at the very beginning. Might be a good way to get more voices involved, so you're hearing from especially young researchers, you know, or it's their first research project, as well as introducing these so that when they're going further, it's kind of inside of what they're doing already.
Is that a common experience? And we'll go to your question after. Oh yeah, go, please.
So we have a research integrity program that the graduate students participate in, and IRB is part of that. So there, because I got bit by the IRB. I never heard of it in my life, and I sent out a simple survey, and they came down on me like a ton of bricks. It was terrible.
Yeah, it totally is.
And so we do have training at the university, so they're not getting blindsided by that, because it's something they need to think of at the earliest stage of their research design. It's not something they can just throw in at the end, because then they're going to run afoul of it. Right. So I think you're absolutely right about that.
So you said it hit you to like a ton of bricks, and they said it. You said it. They bit you.
Oh yeah.
Like both of those metaphors, I think, encapsulate an experience that is very common, and it's one that I don't think is helpful. And I had the same experience. I think there's a lot of shaming that happens in like a compliance or a regulatory compliance approach shuts people down. It shuts me down. It's unhelpful. And especially if we're going to start talking about feelings and bias, like you can get people real defensive real quick. So I would want to make sure that in whatever process we think going forward makes the most sense, that it's built not on shame and compliance, but on we believe that research should protect human dignity. And we want to support everyone's voice in the process. Like create a narrative that we can all buy into, not I'm gonna beat you with a stick if you step out of line, which is typically how it runs now. And like I'm friends with people that are on IRB, like I'm participating with them. I love the work that they're doing. But they self-admit that people see them as Darth Vader. And that's not something that we want to perpetuate, especially if we're gonna get into stickier territory. So I don't know, again, how do we make it that it's safe to say, yeah, I do think that I'm bringing something into this that isn't good. Help me with that. It requires a level of vulnerability that is really uncomfortable and scary, and it's going to take some courage. And so how do we create a space in which those kinds of conversations can happen?
I will say that back when I was a researcher and had to have my research approved through IRB, human research, that we had an individual in our departments whose responsibility was to help guide us through that process. And she had a very positive outlook on this, and I thought having an expert to guide us was helpful. There was mandated training from the time you signed on as a researcher, so you were never surprised. And they started out by talking about Tuskegee. I mean, they went through that
Okay.
so that that we never want to repeat this again, and brought up multiple examples of research ethics. We did not talk about values, I will say.
Yeah, so that's an approach. I turned the scare factor up in this presentation. I showed you the worst of the worst. It's attention grabbing, but is that the best way going forward? Do we want to say, yeah, really crappy stuff happens, but let's talk about the narrative of what we think should happen and focus on dignity, respect, consent, and talk about the model that we're working towards? Or is that part of the narrative? Do we need both?
I would say, that's how, because you mentioned plagiarism earlier, and that's what I usually teach on. And I really do the same thing where I stay away from any kind of punitive aspect of it. I just talk about, this is what being a good researcher is. This is what good research looks like.
Excuse me.
And I do think I think real world examples can help, especially more recent ones, because it gets away from that thing of just oh, this is something that used to happen and it used to be horrible, but it's fine now.
Yeah. Megan.
I am really happy to hear that your IRB board was so receptive to sort of the critical lens that you were bringing to the conversations around their work and the evaluation. I sort of hadn't thought about it in that way before, so it was eye-opening to think about my identity as a science librarian. We all need to sort of market and promote our skills and expertise in this area to go have conversations with IRB as part of something that we do. So that really resonated with me, and I'm curious if you've sort of translated this work into other similar pots within the university. So my immediate thought was tenure and promotion.
Sorry, was that very visible? keep going.
Just maybe some obvious things, but the evaluation metrics there similarly lead to some very problematic outcomes. At the University of New Hampshire, for example, in tenure and promotion for faculty, and I'm a faculty member, but teaching faculty, they do consider student evaluations, but there's been recent studies that have shown that there's actually in a scale of 1 to 10, a 6-point reduction in female evaluation, and they still consider it as a metric for whether or not someone has tenure. And and they're like, well, there's other factors we look at, but it's still a data point. So I can see a lot of the work that you're doing around IRB translating into that space and sort of pushing these neoliberal structures of the university in a lot of different contexts. So have you done this in other areas of the university outside the IRB?
I've done a lot of private grumbling and complaining, and so nothing productive. So we've had some of those conversations about student evaluations with tenure. So this whole topic is framed in something called critical data studies, which borrows a lot from just critical studies in general, and particularly critical race studies has a critique of liberalism that I really like. And a liberal position on the tenure narrative is that a student evaluation is a valid tool, and it is neutral because we're not influencing students, and students are just evaluating what's happening in the classroom. They're not bringing anything to the table. They're not bringing any bias by gender or orientation or race, but it is proven that they are. So what you're describing is very common, and in higher education institutions, there's typically, though not always, that liberal component in how we do evaluative structures. In terms of how to deal with that, the grumbling has largely been people don't even recognize that it's a problem. And it's so shitty. Like it's not okay.
Well, I grumble too, but I guess the inspiring part for our profession is that like this is some work that we can do.
Yeah.
We have to fight for these things.
Yes, and so there's a body to pull from on this critique that is really rich and deep, and they've been doing it for a couple decades. And so like when I came to the table of like, oh my God, I don't think data is neutral anymore. What do? I have to tell everybody. I was really comforted by the fact that like, okay, people have been talking about this before I was born. Okay, thank God. Let me read them, and there's some people already in this space, and so I don't know the best way to address that kind of problem. I do think there's a lot of application of critical data studies into like how tenure and promotion works in an already very problematic system. So yeah, I'm with you. I'm in the same boat. I think it's really crappy the way it's set up now. I do think that this literature can speak to that problem in really informative ways. Is that, like, so Megan and I are like, yeah, that's a problem. But how do other people, like, does that resonate with anybody else here? Or yes. It's okay if not. Like if your institution's like, no, we do it amazing. That'd be great, and we'd come learn from you. Okay. Other thoughts or questions? Yeah.
When you'll see this discussion of identity, safe spaces, and that kind of thing as being highly promoted for the undergraduate experience, because we don't want to turn them off. There are tuition stream.
Oof.
But then you get into the next money stream, which is the products of research, being largely data and its products being owned by the university, especially in something like clinical pharmaceutical research. And if that discussion of ethics starts to hit the bottom line, oops, it's no longer that safest space there, or and even in data sharing, which we support, it could come into play too in somewhat complex ways. I guess I'm thinking of sort of an example is what I've been working with support for doing training around having how people can de-identify their human subjects data to share it, and working with Johns Hopkins, and there's the School of Medicine has started to kind of raise a red flag on, should this be a do-it-yourself practice for the researcher? I can see that is a concern. But the approach is to some extent, well, let's, the reason I came up with the training is because it wasn't addressed by IRB, and probably should be, but and now they're taking that to a committee within the School of Medicine to maybe, okay, should there be a committee within the School of Medicine that needs to review shared data for this reason and the protocols of de-identification. All right, so, but there the concern is in part where those giant fines going to come in if you get your identified and get that breach. So, money motivation first.
Well, let's talk about that. So, okay, so yeah, librarians I think will probably push back on we shouldn't be motivated by money, but nonetheless, it's a reality for how higher education works. So let's put on that administrator hat, not to be demeaning towards administrators, but I actually think that there's an argument on the monetary front of why this is important. Anybody following Pepsi right now? All right. Okay. If you're not following Pepsi, it's all right. Pepsi came out with a commercial. Kendall Jenner was the main star of it, and it used a lot of tropes around protest and identity politics, and a lot of historical reference for like the civil rights movement and Black Lives Matter today. And it did something amazing in that it unified the internet against it. And people called this out as culturally and politically tone deaf, unethical, and insensitive. And it is all of those things. I strongly think that it is an appropriation of really important things happening right now and that has happened, and they use it to sell Pepsi. It is costing Pepsi a ton of money. So much money. Pepsi wishes that they could undo everything in that commercial because there's so much pushback. When any corporation or enterprise missteps here, there's usually a financial cost. Now, the fact that Tuskegee happened by the U.S. government, that's not quite a consumer relationship, or you buy products, but nonetheless, might have an example?
Even governments can misstep and have financial repercussions when they pass laws about same-sex discrimination and...
North Carolina bathroom bill. Yep. How many billions? Many billions. So to push back against hand.
And also, even dealing back to the Tuskegee thing, that was such a black stain on the government that, there's a lot of mistrust towards government programs that wouldn't have been there.
Totally.
And that's what people like the current administration can take advantage of. When you don't trust the government, then that allows people who don't believe in government to take advantage of your views.
And look what happens.
Yeah. It's all because you're ethical.
To your point of what about the bottom line, I think this is actually really relevant to the bottom line. Would that help with any conversation at your institution, like saying, look at these things that have happened that cost so much money. Maybe we shouldn't do them.
Johns Hopkins got into a $1 billion lawsuit involving some of the syphilis studies.
Okay. So yeah.
Oh,
$5 billion? Okay. So while I don't think that money should be the motivating factor behind how we do ethical research, I do think there's a component that if it enters the conversation, that we can actually respond with some really robust examples of why it is monetarily relevant. Yeah.
I think we need to have stronger examples and advice around best practice.
I know.
Because to your point about the research training, that's still going on. A year ago, I went to my institution's responsible conduct of research course, which is mandated for certain levels of grant federal funding. It's tied to the city training that's through the IRB. But my institution opened it up to anybody doing certain types of research on campus. And I did not know it going into it, but have since heard from folks who were surprised that I, as a librarian, did it, that it doesn't have the best of reputations on campus, not punitive like the IRB coming down on you for doing a survey, but more, it's discussion-based, and you have these examples like Tuskegee and Henrietta Lacks, and it's important stuff, but it doesn't go anywhere, and there aren't any answers. And granted, the population is mostly natural and hard science based, so they are not the folks to be naturally inclined towards the types of discussions that go on in women's studies and race studies and all of that, but they have a point. There's, very clear-cut, no, don't do that, but there are very few examples for this is a great idea, or this is something that you can incorporate yourself. And I don't have those answers, but I would love to see them.
Yeah, so best practices, I have no idea. The list I have in front of you guys, I would really, really love your feedback. Email me, call me. I will take you out to coffee if you're ever in Denver. Please help me think through these issues, because this is going to be an ongoing conversation and discussion. And I would love librarians to be in on that conversation. I think we have a lot to bring to the table, but we need to start talking about it. And so we end at 1, is that right? Okay, generally. So if you want to have lunch and talk about this, I'd love to hang out with you guys. But in the last few minutes, any final responses, thoughts? Yeah.
I just have a quick question.
So Sarah Mannheimer, she's up at Montana State University. She does a lot of this and has a really helpful checklist. Data and Society writes about this stuff a lot. I really do mean anything by those three people are amazing. Anna Lorna Hoffman, she actually just was the keynote at Electronic Resources and Libraries, and she did a keynote on data violence. That is amazing. It's streamable. But Dana Boyd and Sophia Noble. So check those guys out. They're amazing. Yeah.
Is it okay to share this worksheet with
Oh, yeah.
other
Yeah.
people at our organization?
Please share away.
Will
And
it also be somehow, when everything is on the repository, be linked to it in some fashion?
I don't know. Let me talk to Julie Goldman about that. I submitted it towards their portal to be printed out. They very helpfully printed all this out. I don't know if it's available. So some of this is borrowed. It's in the cited resources. This is actually inspired by something called a post-occupancy evaluation tool that architecture and urban planning people use, where after a space is built, people go in and they try to evaluate the space. And some of those, like the phrasing of those questions of what activity does this space promote? What activity does this space inhibit? Who are the people that this space would be used most for? Who are the people that would actually be excluded from a space design like this?
What was that report called?
Oh, it's called a post-occupancy evaluation, VAST, V-A-S-T, all caps, values, something in technology, spaces and technology, values, attitude, spaces, and technology, VAST. Comes out of the University of Queensland. God, what's her name? Yeah, I think it's, yeah, it's in the, is it here? Helen Kierkegaard Kramer. Anyway, if it's not here, I'll make sure that I put this in a very public space where you can borrow from the VAST report. Again, it's loosely based. There's a lot of interpretation, so I don't know if they would actually appreciate being associated with this. It's kind of a different project, but they should be cited nonetheless. So, all right, guys, thank you very much.